Masechet Sukkah, Daf Zayin, an amazing daf with 5 different main topics. First, we're going to talk about a case of when you have 2 full walls, plus you need a little something. There's 3 opinions about what else you need. Then we're going to talk about the case of 2 parallel walls side by side, not touching each other. And there's also 3 opinions about what else you need, the minimum to fill in for the third side. Then we're going to see an absolutely fascinating thesis by Rava that Sukkah and Shabbat definitions can affect each other because there is some overlap. What is considered a home, a wall for Sukkah, and what's considered a partition for carrying on Shabbat. And we're going to see an amazing thing that definition of one, even though they have different definitions, if it's Shabbat and Sukkot on the same day, the definitions can actually change each other. And then we'll see about sunlight coming from the side, from the walls. Is that permitted? Or does it have to be shade even from the walls? And lastly, we'll see 8 different opinions who require a permanent structure, dirat keva, against what we saw Rava at the beginning, who says it's dirat arai, a temporary structure. Okay, so we begin with the case that the Tosefta mentioned, where although you need 3 walls, all you really need is 2 full walls that are adjacent to each other. And the third one, we already saw 2 opinions, one by Rav and one by Rav Kahana. Rav mentioned this one, that you can just put it on this edge of this wall or this edge of this wall at a 90-degree angle, and that is sufficient. Then we saw the second opinion that said you should put it on an angle. That way it's pointing towards the other one, and that way visually it looks more like it's actually enclosing the structure. And now we begin with a third opinion, which is here. Rav Simon. Simon is the same as Shimon in Hebrew, but when it turns into Greek, it becomes like Simon, and back into Aramaic, it becomes to be Simon. So he says, V'tem Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Amar oseh lo tefach sochek, uma'amido bepachot mishelosha tefachim samuch ladofen. Bechol pachot mishelosha samuch ladofen kelavud dameh. He requires a little bit more. You take not just a tefach, but a smiling tefach. Well, a smiling tefach is like 1.1 tefachim, a little bit bigger than a tefach. It's called smiling because when you smile, your mouth expands. So this is an expanded tefach. And don't put it right adjacent to one of the walls, but rather away from one of the walls, a little bit less than 3 tefachim. Because anything that's less than 3 tefachim is called lavud. It's considered as if it's all connected. So it would end up looking like this. Right? You have 2 full walls, and the third one, you take a little bit more than a tefach and put it a little closer than 3 tefachim. Therefore, this little less than 3 tefachim is considered as if it's filled in. So we have, as if we could make believe, a wall of 4 tefachim. Now the minimum size of a sukkah is 7 tefachim, but 4 out of 7 is already the majority. So you have, by filling this in and considering it a majority, you have more or less, less, as if a wall of 7 tefachim, and so that is sufficient for a wall, and therefore you have almost a full wall. So that's Rabbi Simon, who requires more than just a tefach, like the other opinions. Good. Now, Amar Rav Yehudah, Sukkah asuya kemavoy keshera, ve'oto tefach ma'amido lechol ruach she'irseh. Okay, so now we're going to see, we finished A. Now we're going to see B, 3 opinions about 2 parallel walls. Rav Yehudah is going to make a handbreadth anywhere you want. We're going to have Rav Simon again. He's going to do a similar configuration, but this time he's going to require 4.1 handbreadth wall, 2.9 away from the edge. And we're going to see Rava that says a doorway. So we saw Rav Yehudah first, and he says like this, right? You have 2 full walls parallel, so you need a tefach By the way, if you're listening and not looking on YouTube, I recommend you stop because we're going to see a lot of pictures today, and it'll make it much easier. So you put a tefach anywhere adjacent to any of the edges of the wall, and that's all you need. That is the first opinion of Rav Yehudah. Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Simon, Ivitem Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, or others say it was Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Oseh lo pas arba'a umashehu. You take a board that's 4 tefachim plus a little bit, right? A smiling one. Uma'amido bepachot mishelosha samuch ladofen, and put it a little bit less than 3 tefachim, handbreadths, away from the edge of the wall. And that will be as if it's filled in. So end up looking like this, 2 full walls. And now you have something that's 4, and you put it close to this one. So this is lavud, it's like nothing. So you actually have a wall of 7 tefachim. Once you have 7 tefachim, that itself could be a wall, and so then you can ignore the empty space. Already have something that looks very much like an enclosed area. So that's all you need. Now, obvious question. Rabbi Simon taught 2 things. Why? And they're different. Why? How come in the case of adjacent walls like an L, all you needed was 1 smiling tefach, and you put that less than 3 away from the wall? And in this case, when you have parallel walls, you require a board that's a little more than 4 tefachim, and putting that 3 more. What's the difference? Why don't you say the same thing for both? And the answer is, Hatam de'ika shete defanot kil chatan, sagile betefach sochek. Hacha deleka shete defanot, ika pas arba'a in ila la. The explanation doesn't really add too much information, but basically he's saying, in that first case where you have 2 walls, proper walls in the sense that they are connecting to each other. So that creates an atmosphere of an enclosure. So because you have that, it's enough just to put 1 more tefach, 3 tefachim away, and you'll have a full sense of an enclosure. Here, when you do not have 2 walls, you see, you do have 2 walls, but because they're side by side, it looks more like a hallway or a thoroughfare. It doesn't quite have a feeling of a room. So therefore, in that case, you need to have more. You need 4 tefachim of a solid wall, put that more than 3 away, a little less than 3 away, and then you have more of an enclosure. So it's better to have adjacent than to have parallel walls. Okay, and now we're going to get to the last opinion. Amar Rava ve'ena niteret ela besurata petach. Okay, we're going to see actually 3 different versions of Rava's statement. The first one disagrees with what's above and says, no, is no good unless you have a surat hapetach. Surat hapetach we're familiar with from Eruvin, which is you have 2 poles and a long beam on top. And so this is a doorway, right? Because any wall, you're always going to have doorways. So how many doorways can you have? How big can a doorway be? We solved all that in Eruvin. So you need something that looks like a doorway, and that will fill in the wall. So that is Rava's opinion. Now, and I'm going to interpret the Talmud that Rava is still talking about this case of 2 parallel walls. And he says for the parallel walls, you need a doorway. And that seems to be the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel and Harambam. Rashi is kind of interestingly, strangely interprets this statement of Rava, which I called number 3. He says this is an answer number 4 to the first case, that Rava is talking about adjacent walls. According to that, it's a bit strange that we were talking about that topic, then we went to parallel walls, and then we're coming back to the topic of adjacent walls. So I don't think it's necessary to do that, but in the pictures that we're going to see, the pictures follow Rashi. So I'll try to explain it both ways. Okay, so Rava, in version number 1 of Rava, disagrees with what's above and says you need a doorway. Version number 2, he says either or. You can follow the opinions before and put a tefach or 4 tefachim, whatever Rabbi Simon said, in whichever case, and then the rest of it, you could do that, or you could do a doorway, as I said. The third version, you need both. Some kind of tefach somewhere and a surat petach. So that third one, here's a picture of what it would look like according to Rashi, who says it's talking about a case of adjacent walls. So then you'd have to do what Rabbi Simon says, take a tefach and put it less than 3 away. And the rest of it, you would have to make a doorway. According to the way I prefer to interpret it, like Rabbeinu Hananel is talking about this case here. He's continuing to talk about parallel walls. And so you'd have to do what Rabbi Simon said. And in addition to that, you'd have to make another pole, a vertical pole here and a horizontal pole on top to fill in the rest. Okay, so that's the 3 versions of Rava. And now we have a little story. Rav Ashe Ashkeche le Rav Kahana teka aved tefach sochek. Rav Ashe one time was walking around and he saw Rav Kahana was using the tefach with a little more than tefach, following Rabbi Simon. And he was also making a surat petach. This is possibly why Rashi says that it's talking about adjacent walls, because in this story that comes right after is tefach shochek, not 4. Okay. Anyway, he sees this. Amar le lo sabar mor lehad Ravad amar Rava v'niteret nameh besurat petach. Says, why are you making both? Don't you know what Rava says? Rava says you don't have to do both. You can do either or. You can make that tefach away from the wall, or you can make a surat petach. Why are you making both? And Rav Kahana answers, Amar le, ana ki idach li shana de Ravad sibirali, Amar Rava usricha nameh surat petach. I follow the third version of Rava, that you need both of them. Okay, so this is a very nice story, and that is going to be the halacha because it ends with it. It's an interesting story because for a few reasons. First of all, we have these 3 ikadam, these 3 versions of Rava, right? When did these start? When did we get confused about what Rava said? Normally I might say it's at the time of the editors of the Talmud. They gathered together and they didn't know. But according to this, you see, even in the times of Rav Ashe is a 6th generation Amora, and he's talking to his colleague Rav Kahana, and so already they have different versions of Rava that they're discussing. Okay, another thing that's interesting is, see, Rav Kahana is talking to Rav Ashe, who is 6th generation, so that means Rav Kahana has to be around the 6th generation. On the other hand, we had another Rav Kahana over here who was talking to Rav, and so that would have to be an earlier generation. So you see that there must be more than one Rav Kahana. And there actually is. Rav Kahana is a very common name. They're all Kohanim, but they are, we had it, the conversation was up here. Amar le Rav Kahana ve'Rav Aseh le Rav. You see, Rav Kahana is talking to Rav, who's 1st generation. So there are many Rav Kahanas. They're all Kohanim, but they are do not all live at the same time. Okay, so that's just a little interesting biography. And that concludes this sections A and B. And now we're going to get to conceptually this very interesting section of Rava's thesis, comparing Sukkah, requirements of Sukkah and requirements of Shabbat. So here it is, Shetam Kil Chatan. So now we're definitely going back to the case of the Tosefta of 2 adjacent walls. Amar Rava, V'chen leShabbat. He says this is also true on Shabbat. Migo de havya dofen le'inyan Sukkah, havya dofen le'inyan Shabbat. Because 2 walls plus a little bit, that tefach that you put somewhere, since it is considered an enclosure for Sukkah, so too it will be considered walls and an enclosure to create a Reshut HaYachid on Shabbat. And here's a nice picture that will explain it better. Okay, so here you have one wall of the house, another wall that's full, and you add another tefach, according to that first opinion of Rav. And so if you put schach on top of this, then you have a perfectly fine sukkah, according to those opinions. Now, what if you want to carry in and out of the house? On a normal Shabbat, not when it's not Sukkot, this is not sufficient. For Shabbat, in order to make it a Reshut HaYachid, you need 3 walls, and it's not sufficient to have this imaginary wall here. However, here's Rava's Chidush, when Shabbat falls out on Sukkot, because this is a good definition of an enclosure for Sukkah, that definition transfers over for the laws of Shabbat. And if you carry in and out of the house on Shabbat of Sukkot, that's perfectly fine, which is quite an amazing thing. The very same action, the very same structure, one Shabbat will be prohibited and the other Shabbat will be permitted. Question?
Yeah, but then in order for that to be the case, you must have put schach.
Yes, it's assuming there is schach, correct.
Okay.
Good. I was trying to think of an analogy to anything else that's like this. The best I could come up with, if there's a drug that's approved by the FDA for diabetes, but not for cancer. But then there's some studies that show it's good for cancer. So your insurance company won't cover it for this, but will cover it for that. But if you happen to have diabetes and cancer, then they'll cover it for this, and then they'll also cover, even if it's a higher prescription for cancer, even though it doesn't make sense, because why should they cover the higher prescription if they don't cover it if you didn't have the diabetes? So something like that. Sometimes you have something that is considered valid for one definition, then it can transfer over to the other definition as well. Okay, so that's absolutely fascinating. His colleague Abaye is going to challenge him. Do you say this principle of since it's defined as a wall for Sukkah, therefore it's going to be defined as a wall for Shabbat when Shabbat is on Sukkot? We have a braita that seems to say not so. Dofen Sukkah ke dofen Shabbat shelo yehe ba kaneh lachabero shelosha tefachim. So this braita starts off saying in what way they're the same. Wall for a sukkah is the same as a wall for Shabbat. In both of them, you have to make sure that between each reed and the next one, you don't have 3 tefachim or more. As long as you have less than 3 tefachim, we call it lavud. So theoretically, you could have for a sukkah, you could make a sukkah just out of reeds that are less than 3 apart each one. And in fact, we do this. If you ever see the lavud sukkah, the sukkah just with straps, you don't even need walls, and doesn't even have to go up to the top because we can add gud asik. So you just need 4 or so straps up down here, and the rest could be empty space. You could also do it vertically if you have like a picket fence or something. So this is true both for Shabbat. You have to make sure that nowhere do you have a space that's bigger than 3 tefachim. But here is where the difference comes in. V'tera Shabbat al sukkah, she'ashabbat ena niteret ela be'omed merubeh ala parutz, ma she'en ken basukkah. Shabbat is more machmir than the sukkah because a Shabbat, you can have some spaces here and there, but you have to make sure that there's more solid wall than space altogether. If you count up all the solid wall, that's to be the majority. So you can't have a lavud wall, a total lavud wall like you can have on sukkah. And for a sukkah, you can have more space than solid wall. Here is a picture of what this might look like. So you can use lavud a lot, but for Shabbat, you have to make sure that there's more wall space than empty space. If this was switched, if you took out each part of this wall, it would be okay for a sukkah, but not for Shabbat. Okay, so that's one way in which Shabbat is more. Now, that's the braita. Now, if we analyze this braita, it looks like it's saying the laws of Shabbat are more chamor than a sukkah, right? Ma'alav yetera Shabbat de sukkah a sukkah velo amdinan migo. It sounds like even on Shabbat of Sukkot, that there'll be a chumrah than the laws of sukkah. So that would mean, for example, if you had Shabbat falls out on Sukkot, which it always does, that would mean that in such a case where you have more empty space than not, that you would be able to eat in the sukkah and sleep in the sukkah. But if you carried from the sukkah to your house, then you'd be chayav, because for the laws of Shabbat, it's not an enclosure. For the laws of Sukkah, it is an enclosure. And that seems to be the simple reading of Yetera Shabbat al Sukkah. So that's Abaye's challenge to Rava. We don't see the principle of migo in the language of Yetera Shabbat al Sukkah. So Rava answers, La Yetera Shabbat alma al Shabbat de Sukkah. Well, no, I'm totally fine. What the Braita means to say is Shabbat, 51 Shabbatot of the year, is more machmir than Shabbat when it's on Sukkot. 51 days of the year. If you had a totally lavud sukkah with more space, then it would more a booth. Then with more space, then that would be considered shut harabim, and you wouldn't be able to carry from there into your house. But on Shabbat of Sukkah, it's okay, because since you're permitted to have a Sukkah that way, so too you can have it on Shabbat. So he can say, I'm fine with the Braita. Abaye challenges him once again. Now, sometimes there is the other way around, that the laws of Sukkah are more machmir than the laws of Shabbat. It's very interesting because they're just different conceptions of an enclosure. For Sukkah, you need to make a room, an enclosure. On Shabbat, you need to make, and it has to be for Sukkah, has to be kind of recognizable as such. For Shabbat, it has to be a partition. So there are different definitions. So in what way is Sukkah more machmir? Dilu Sukkah de'alma bayat tefach sochek. Dilu Sukkah de Shabbat la bayat tefach sochek. Evesage belechi. So for a Sukkah, which we just said, if you have two walls, you need the third side to be a little bit, let's say two walls parallel. You need two walls this way, right? You need the third side to be an expanded tefach, a little bit more than a tefach. Whereas Shabbat, it doesn't have to be. All you need is a lechi. We're talking about a mavoy now. What's a mavoy? Let's remind ourselves. By the way, this would be a case that we had just now of on Sukkot. You have a sukkah that has more space than solid wall, right? Because you have two almost totally empty except for the tefach, and you have doorways. You're allowed to have doorways. If you count up all the solid area, it's less than the open area. So this is okay for a sukkah. According to Rava, it would also be okay. Normally, this would not be okay for Shabbat, but according to Rava, on Shabbat, this would be fine as a reshut hayachid. Okay, a mavoy that we're talking about is like this. On Shabbat, if you have two walls and the reshut harabim is in front of it, then all you need to do is put a lechi, and on the doraita level anyway, midrabanan, you actually need three walls. But he's talking about on the doraita level. On the doraita level, all you need is two walls and a lechi that could be just a tefach. Whereas for sukkah, you need the lechi to be a little bit more than a tefach. So here's a case where sukkah normally would be more machmir than Shabbat. And yet, deha atu de'amart, you, Rava, you say, sikech al gabe mavoy sheyesh lo lechi kasher. If you put schach on top of this mavoy, on top of this alleyway, imagine this schach on top, that would be a good sukkah on Shabbat. So this is an amazing case where it's the other way around. If I made a sukkah like this during the week, it would not be good because, right, we saw two parallel walls. It's not sufficient just to put a lechi, right? You have to have a bigger lechi, move it away. We saw the different opinions about what you have to do. This is not good as a sukkah during the week. But on Shabbat, because on Shabbat, this is considered an enclosed area as a mavoy, and therefore the definition of Shabbat can transfer to sukkah. And on Shabbat of Sukkot, I am allowed to sit in the sukkah. So this is an amazing law the other way, that the very same structure I cannot eat in on during the weekday, but I can eat in on Shabbat of Sukkot. So the question that Abaye challenges him is, how come the Braita doesn't talk about this case? If the Braita accepts migo, then it should have brought this case as well as a flip side. Sometimes Shabbat is more machmir, sometimes Sukkah is more machmir. And Rava's answer is, Hahu la istaricha le hashta mikilta lechamirta amrinan mechamirta lekilta lo kol sheken. He said, really, the Braita would agree with it, but it doesn't even have to say it. It's obvious. If something that is more mekel applies to something more machmir, the thing that's more mekel here is the laws of Sukkah. The law of Sukkah is a mitzvah aseh, and you can take the definition of Sukkah and apply it to Shabbat, which is chamor. Shabbat is karet, sikila. So then all the more so, you can take the definition for something chamor and apply it to something that's mekel. And therefore, I wouldn't even have to say that the case of mavoy, which is an enclosure for Shabbat, for sure it will be an enclosure for Sukkah. The Braita didn't have to say it, but indeed, I agree that is the case. Okay, so that's the end of Abaye's challenges. Rava happened to talk about yet another case of transferring definitions. So now we're going to go into it. Gufa, Amar Rava, we only quoted a little part of what Rava said above. Here's the full statement. There's two statements. Sikech al gabe mavoy sheyesh lo lechi keshera. This is one we saw already. If you take a mavoy, which is an alleyway, it's two sides and just one lechi, and you put schach on top, that's a kosher sukkah on Shabbat of Sukkot. That's number one. Ve'amar Rava, sikech al gabe paseh biraot keshera. He also said, if you put schach on top of this enclosure of brackets, we mentioned this the other day, that the rabbis had a special kula for people traveling. Sometimes they come to a well and they'll stay there. Their caravan will stay there for Shabbat. And they need water. So you have a well. A well itself is Reshut HaYachid. Everything around it is Reshut HaRabim. So now it's very difficult to go build a whole structure around it. So the rabbis made a special kula for the sake of getting water, that as long as you put brackets on the corners, right, one here and each of them, you don't need full walls. This architecturally looks like, it draws your eyes to look like there are 4 walls, and that is sufficient for the laws of Shabbat. Now, nobody thinks that this is okay for a sukkah. Sukkah has to have 2 full walls. You can't just have corners. Actually, not nobody. We saw the Yaakov, remember, way above with the poles on the roof. So he might agree with this. But everybody else says that this is no good. Here's Rava's Chidush. If it happens to be Shabbat and Sukkot on the same day, because this is considered an enclosure, a Reshut HaYachid for Shabbat, therefore, if I put schach on top of it, it's also a kosher sukkah on Shabbat of Sukkot. Not on Sunday, not on Monday, but on Shabbat, this is a good enclosure. So this is the third case of the transferring definitions. If it's good for Shabbat, then it's good for Sukkah also, although normally it wouldn't be. Okay, now we ask, why does Rava have to talk about both of these cases here? The case of Mavoy and the case of Paseh Biraot. If you only told us the first case of the 2 walls, I would say, okay, you have 2 solid walls. So I understand that I can transfer that to a sukkah. But regarding the corner brackets, where I don't even have 1 full wall, I might say no, I can't apply the definition to a sukkah to that extent. So that's why he has to tell me the second case. If he only told me the case of the corner brackets like this, I would say at least here there's a sense of 4 walls, right? There's at least the beginnings of 4 walls. Like it looks like something. But with the mavoy, but mavoy, there's really only 2 and a little thing. The fourth one is not there at all. I might say no. That's why Rava tells us both of these cases, each of them has a chidush. And now these 2 cases, it tells us, besides the other one that we said, these 2 cases I'm learning from Shabbat to Sukkah, which is chamur to mekel. But I might not know that I can learn from the laws of Sukkah to the laws of Shabbat. So therefore, Siricha, that's why Rava also had to tell us the other case when you have 2 walls adjacent and tefach sochek, which is permitted for the laws of Sukkah. He teaches us that on Shabbat, you can also consider that, on Shabbat of Sukkot, you can also consider that a Reshut HaYachid, even though we're learning from the Kula to the Chumrah, from Sukkah to Shabbat. So this is a really fantastic chidush that Rava has taught us. Okay, so that's number 3. Now we're going to talk about the walls. The Mishnah mentioned that the schach has to have more shade than sun. Okay, what if you have that, but the walls are open, one of the walls or whatever, or the walls have holes in them, or like this case where you have lots of sun, right? You're sitting there and you're not getting any shade at all because the wall is open. Is that okay? Or do you have to have shade from the walls as well? That is the next question. And so we begin, there's more sun than shade, it's no good. So the Tanakama, which is what we follow, is that we're only talking about the definition of the sechach has to have more shade than sun. But the walls, they could be made out of see-through material, they can have holes in them, they could be, missing 1+ walls and have plenty of sun coming in, and we don't care about the sun that's coming from the sides. However, the Yoshia Omer af mechamat tefanot. Yoshia says I have to take into account walls as well. A wall is not a good wall if it has more sun than shade coming in. It has to be a complete wall. Okay, that's Rabbi Yoshia. Amar Bar Shedem Yamishime de Abaye. My ta'ameh de Rabbi Yoshia. What's the source of Rabbi Yoshia? Tichti v'sakota al ha'aron et ha'parochet. The pasuk says that you have to put a screen, the sakota, which by the way is the same root as sukkah and sechach. So you have to cover or protect over the aron with the parochet. Now the parochet is the curtain that divides between the kodesh kodashim and the kodesh. So it's not actually on top of the aron, and yes, so it's a vertical wall, a curtain separating near the aron, and yet it calls it v'sakota. So parochet mechisa, it's a division, and yet it calls it protecting. Alma mechisa kischach ba'inan. So therefore we learn that the walls also have to protect as schach, and so it has to have more shade than sun, even though it's just a wall. So that seems to be very interesting and pretty good proof. So we turn the tables. Rabanan, what are you going to do with that pasuk? And they say, yes, true, most of that curtain is vertical, but this pasuk teaches us that on top it should bend a little so that it will be covering the aron, or at least look like it's covering the aron. So part of it is horizontal as well as a roof, and that's why it's called the sakota. So really the sakota is only for something that protects from the top. All right, good. That is the end of part D. And now we get to the last section, part E, which is 8 different opinions that say you need a permanent structure. So this is said by Abaye, Amar Abaye. If we remember, Abaye and Rava are really at it today, right? We had them arguing before. Rava is the one that said way at the beginning that it should be defined, Sukkah should be defined as dirat arai. And that's why you can't have the walls or walls too high. Abaye seems to be trying to muster a lot of proof against Rava and says, look at all these opinions that say, even though it's true, you're only living in it for 7 days as in a temporary time period, nevertheless, the building of it has to be built as a permanent residence, right? You have to make it into your home. So he's going to see that in 8 different halachot. Each halacha is said by someone else. Rabbi Yoshia, Rabbi Yehudah, Rabbi Shimon, Rabban Gamliel, Ubet Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, Va'acherim, Kulehu Sevira Lehu Sukkah Dirat Keva Ba'inan. All of these 8 sages from different time periods, different issues, but they all agree that it has to be a permanent structure. Okay, but they all disagree on the definition. In fact, they internally disagree with each other, but they have this in common that they think that something is more permanent than whoever they're disagreeing with. Now we're going to go through all 8. Rabbi de Tanya, Rabbi Omer kol sukkah she'en ba'arba'a amot arba'a amot pesula. Rabbi said the minimum size of a sukkah widthwise is 4 amot by 4 amot. That's the size of a room or a house, according to definitions like for mezuzah and ma'akeh and other things. So you see, it has to be the size of a permanent structure. This is against the other chachamim that said just 7 by 7 tefachim, enough for your body and a table, or just your body. So that's much smaller. So the B says it has to be the size that would be like a permanent structure. Okay, that's number 1. Rabbi Yoshia, de Amaran. Rabbi Yoshia says it has to be permanent structure because he said the walls have to be give more shade than sunlight. Well, that's a characteristic of a permanent residence, that you have walls that are somewhat solid. That's 2. That's why this whole thing is brought right here. Rabbi Yehudah ditnan sukkah shegeboha lemala me'asrim amma pesula. Rabbi Yehudah machshir. So from the highest sukkah, the rabbis say it could only be 20 amot. or less than 20 amot. Rabbi Yehudah says it can be even more than 20 amot. To make it more than 20 amot, you're going to have to make the walls out of something really solid to hold up that structure. That's a permanent structure. That's exactly the case that Rava disagreed and said he followed a banan that say you need an impermanent, a temporary structure. So Abaya picks up on that and says, look, according to the Rav Yehudah, you need a permanent structure. Rabbi Shimon, the Tanya. שתיים כהלכתן ושלישית אפילו טפח. רבי שמעון אומר שלוש כהלכתן ורבית אפילו טפח. This is machlokes we saw yesterday. According to Tanakama, you need 2 full walls and the third one could just be a little bit. Rabbi Shimon says you need 3 full walls and a 4th one a little bit. So the fact that he says you need 4 walls, that's a permanent structure, right? Permanent structures have 4 walls. Or 3 plus walls. So the Rabbi Shimon is counted in the list against Tanakama. Next, Rabban Gamliel de Tanya ose sukato berosh agala or berosh sefina. Rabban Gamliel posel, ve'Rabbi Akiva machshir. So the Baraita says, according to Tanakama, if you make a sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a boat, this is like Chabad makes their sukkah on top of a pickup truck. Right, so Rabban Gamliel says it's no good. Rabbi Akiva says it's fine. So Rabban Gamliel says no good. Why? Because it's not a permanent residence. Right, people don't live on top of pickup trucks or boats. Generally, I guess nowadays we have these big boats that you can live on, but in those days not so much. So therefore, it's not a permanent structure if it is on a movable area. And the next opinion is Bet Shammai Ditnan. Misha Roshov Rebo Basuka v'Shulchano betoch habayit. Bet Shammai poslin uBet Hillel machshirin. So according to Bet Shammai, if you have a minimum size of a sukkah, or not minimum, this is how you use it, could be, right? If you have your head and your body, no, we're talking about size here, right? If a sukkah is big enough to hold your head and most of your body, but not your table, then it's no good. Why not? According to this, we're saying because it's not a permanent structure. Something that's so small that you can't put any furniture in it. Your table is no good. Bet Hillel says it's okay because a temporary structure, you don't need your table. Okay, this is very interesting because this is different from Rabbi Yehudah, who said before, he says he needs permanent because it's 4x4. He disagreed with Rabbi Shimon, with Bet Shammai. So we see in this list are people that disagree with each other, right? And regarding the size. So Rabbi, according to Rabbi, you need 4x4. That shows he needs a permanent structure compared to Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. But within Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai needs it to be more permanent in terms of size and usage. You need your table in there more than Bet Hillel, who doesn't require those. Okay, this is also super interesting because up above we said the reason for Bet Shammai that you need your table with you is because if the table is outside, you're going to inch out, right? Is a gezerah that you're going to end up being outside the sukkah if your food is outside the sukkah. And Bet Hillel didn't care about that. That was a gezerah shema. We have a general rule that anytime you see the word gezerah shema, it's a bavli reason that is not found anywhere in Tanaitic or Yerushalmi. So really that reason doesn't make sense. That would be the Pashat of Bet Shammai. So you see here, the Bavli itself gives another reason for Bet Shammai who were requiring the table to be inside with him, that he has an idea of it being more of a permanent structure. Okay, and then it'd be Eliezer Ditnan. How says Sukato Kimin Serif או ששמחה לכותל, רבי אליעזר פוסל לפי שאין לה גג, וחכמים מכשירים. If someone makes his sukkah I'll show you a picture. This is Bet Shammai. Sirif, like a tent. Or you just put a wall, and the wall goes up to on the diagonal up to the other wall. This is no good because there's no roof. And so now we're saying the Rabbi Eliezer must agree that it has to be a permanent structure because no one lives in a permanent structure in a house without a roof. You can make other things like that, a hut, a tent, or something, a storage unit. This thing over here is a dovecote, right? You have all the birds living in there, but these things have no roofs, and that is not a permanent structure. And that is why the Rabbi Eliezer says it's no good, even though Chachamim say it's okay. And lastly, Acherim, Detanya acherim omerim sukkah asuya keshobach pesula lefi she'en la zaviyot. Sorry, this is the dovecote here. That if you make a sukkah like a dovecote, it's no good because it's round, and nobody lives in a house. It has no corners. People like to have a corner to feel cozy. And so if it's completely round, it is no good. Oh, there you go. So that's all 8 different opinions that have this in common, that they have some aspect of the sukkah that looks like it's going to be a permanent structure. Okay, this last statement that you cannot have a round sukkah will be the subject of analysis tomorrow when we calculate the ratio of pi according to the Talmud, but you'll have to wait till tomorrow for that. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen ve'amen.